Hi and welcome to another story, and today we have part 6 of The Suitcase Kid by Jacqueline Wilson, continuing from page 118. T is for time to go home. There aren't any buses in the middle of the night. Larkspur Lane is a long bus ride away. I wasn't sure how long it would take me to walk. I'd never been out that late at night before, certainly not by myself. The stars and the streetlights stopped it being too dark, but it was still pretty scary. It was cold and strange, and all the streets seemed so empty. And yet whenever a car went by, or a man walked past, I shrank away from them. I tried to think of poor little Radish stuck down the tree, but I couldn't stop thinking about poor little me, too. I remembered all the things Mum and Dad had said about strangers, and when a man slowed down, when he saw me and said, "What's up, dear? Why are you out here, all on your own at this time?" I shot past and went flying off down the street. He called after me and then started running too. I ran faster, heart thudding, feet pounding, dodging down an alley and round someone's garden, and down another passage and out into another road, and then another, running and running and running. And when at last I stopped, spread-eagled against a wall with a great tearing stitch in my side, the man was nowhere to be seen. He might have been a kind man, trying to look after me. He might have been a monster, ready to make off with me. There was no way of telling. I didn't even know where I was anymore. I stared around at the dark, unfamiliar buildings in panic. I could try going back along the alley, but the man might be waiting. I started shaking and shivering. My cheeks got a bit wet. My hands seemed horribly empty, but then I tucked my thumb inside my fist and tried to kid myself it was Radish, and it helped just a little bit. I ran on down the road, and when I turned the corner, I was at the shops. I knew how to get back to Mum's place in less than 5 minutes, but I couldn't go back. Katie would be still lying awake, and how she'd sneer if I came creeping back so soon. And Radish was still down the tree, so lost and lonely and frightened. I thought of her tiny heart beating violently under her soft fur, and my face screwed up in pain. "I'm coming, Radish," I whispered. I stared up at the stars. "You've got to make my wish come true." So I set off walking. I walked and walked and walked. I walked until I was so tired I started to wonder if I was dreaming. Everything seemed so strange and silvery in the starlight, and every so often my head would nod and I'd stumble and start. I kept expecting to blink my eyes and find myself tucked up in bed at Mum's, but it didn't happen. So I just walked some more, my head down, shoulders hunched, feet going left, right, left, right, left, right. I missed my way several times, but then I'd suddenly recognise a shop or a house, and I'd know I was back on course again. But then I found myself in streets, and I was certain I'd never seen before. I walked on, and yet it was all new and different, and I realised I was lost again. I tried going back, but I kept getting to corners and not knowing whether to take the left turn or the right. So in the end, I kept on walking anyway, and after a while I stopped thinking and finding the way. I just looked up at the stars and whispered Radish's name and walked on and on and on. Then I suddenly recognised a house at the end of the road, with gables and a curly iron gate and a caravan parked in the front drive. It was Aileen's house, and she went on her holidays in that caravan, and we'd swung on that gate together, and she was probably asleep in her bedroom under the gables right this minute. "Aileen's house," I whispered. Then I'd somehow missed Larkspur Lane altogether. I'd bypassed the school. I was back in my own old territory, the other side of the school, the part of the town where I never went any more. If this was Aileen's house, then I knew what was down the road and round the corner. I stood still, shivering. No, I had to go to Larkspur Lane and find Radish. I couldn't waste time going anywhere else. But I had to. My feet started walking and I couldn't stop them. I went past Aileen's house, past all the other houses in the road with their neat privet hedges and their pointed roofs making a zigzag pattern against the starry sky. I got to the corner. I stood still again, holding my thumb. Then I started walking, very, very slowly. I could see it in the starlight, a cottage at the end of the road. I could only see in black and white, but it was easy to paint in the colours. A white cottage with a grey slate roof and a black chimney and a bright butter-yellow front door. There were yellow roses and honeysuckle growing up a lattice round the door and the leaded windows, and lots of other flowers growing in the big garden. And in the middle of the garden was the old twisted tree, with the big branches bent almost to the ground, and at the tip of each twig grew big bunches of black mulberries. No mulberries. The berries had long ago withered on the tree. No roses, just tangled thorny branches. No sweet-smelling honeysuckle, just leathery stems, trailing untidily. But it was still Mulberry Cottage. I was back. I was home. U is for unconscious. "Andy, darling, is that you?" Mum's at the door, smiling at me. "Come in, sugar lump. I've got tea already on the table." Yes, come on, Andy. Mum's made a lovely mulberry pie, and my mouth's watering, Dad calls. Dad! I step inside, shaking my head. Dad, what are you doing here? He got off work early, didn't you, darling, says Mum. But what are we doing here, I say, dazed. We live here, silly, says Mum. And she ruffles my hair. What's up, Andy? Don't you feel very well? No, I feel wonderful. I can't believe it. Was it all a dream then? All that about leaving Mulberry Cottage and you having Bill and Dad having Carrie and... I think you're still half asleep, pet. Come on, let's have tea. We're all hungry. Mum takes my hand and leads me into the living room. Dad's sitting at the table, smiling at me. There's a big bunch of our pink roses in a pretty white vase, and there are little fairy cakes with pink icing and white rosettes, and the newly baked mulberry pie, dark wine-red juice bubbling up through a crack in the golden pastry and filling the whole room with a rich fruity smell. Mum cuts me a huge slice and tops it with vanilla ice cream. I bite into hot and cold, crunchy and smooth, sweet and sharp, and close my eyes with the bliss of it. I say, and Mum and Dad laugh. Doesn't Radish want some too, says Mum. Radish, I say, and there she is, safe and sound, tucked up in my pocket, half asleep too. Mum lets me fetch a doll's house saucer and a china thimble, and Radish eats and drinks with us. But wait, this is the thimble I swapped with Aileen ages ago, I say, puzzled. Well, you must have swapped it back again, says Mum. And maybe you'll get swapping yet again, because I've got a little surprise in my pocket for you. And your Radish, says Dad. A present? I jump up and run to Dad. Oh, darling, you do spoil her, says Mum. I like spoiling both my best girls, says Dad, and he gives me a present out of one pocket, and Mum a present from the other. Mine is a small square cardboard box, and inside is a tiny radish-size gilt table and chair, and sellotaped safely to the tabletop is a tiny pink china cup and saucer and plate, delicately edged with a wisp of gold paint. Mum's present is another cardboard box, and it's a proper-sized pink china teacup and saucer, with cherubs flying all around the rim, and a little message in looping writing at the bottom of the cup. The message says, I love you. Dad says it too. Mum goes as pink as her cup, and they give each other a long kiss. Radish and I grin at each other. We are all very pleased with our presents. We eat up the pie and ice cream, and every one of the fairy cakes, and then we all go to do the washing up together, making it a game. Dad keeps flapping the tea towel, and I put my fingers on my head to make horns, and rush around pretending to be a little bull. And Mum makes out we're getting on her nerves, but she keeps laughing, and we're still all in a giggly mood when we go back into the living room, as if it's a special day like Christmas. We switch on the television, and my very favourite film, The Wizard of Oz, is just starting, and so Mum and Dad and Radish and I all cuddle up to watch it. I've got my red slippers on, and Mum and Dad keep calling me Dorothy, and I turn Radish into Toto and make her give little barks. We sing along to all the songs, and at the end of the film, when Dorothy clicks the heels of her ruby slippers and whispered, There's no place like home, I suddenly start crying. What's up, darling, says Mum. Don't be sad, little sausage, says Dad. I'm not sad. I'm crying because I'm so happy, I say, sniffling. You funny old thing, says Mum, and she pulls me on her lap for a cuddle. When the film finishes, I climb onto Dad's lap instead, and he reads me a story. Lots of stories from all the storybooks I had when I was little. But then they got lost somewhere. I'm sure they did, I say. Well, we found them again, especially for you, says Dad, giving me a kiss. You don't mind reading me such babyish stuff, Dad. You're our baby, aren't you, says Dad, giving me a tickle. Come on, little babykins. Say coochie coo for your dad, Dad. Oh, Dad, don't be so daft, I say, shrieking with laughter. I don't know. Tears 1 minute, a great big fit of the giggles the next. I think it must be bedtime, says Mum. Oh, no, I say. But I don't argue too much because I don't want to spoil anything, and it's easy to be good when I'm so happy. I got into the bath, and Radish gets in with me and floats about as merry as a little duck. And then we both get dry and powdered and into our nighties, and then Dad comes and carries me into his bed as if I really am a baby. He tucks me up and he tucks Radish up too. And he kisses both our noses, which makes me giggle again. Then Mum comes and she tickles us both under the chin, and we giggle some more. And then Mum and Dad stand arm in arm at the front of my bed, chatting softly to each other while Radish and I snuggle up. The bed's so soft and I feel so safe with all my own things around me, my own rabbit pictures on the wall, my own wardrobe, my own toy cupboard and my own bookshelf, my own Radish in my hand, my own Mum and Dad right by my bed, together. I'm so happy I want this moment to last forever, but I'm so sleepy too, and I can't stop my eyes closing, and I know I'm going to sleep, and I'm suddenly worried because I know it can't last, and then it's going to be very different when I wake up, and I try to open my eyes wide, but they're so heavy, and I have to rest them just for a second, and then they won't open again, and I'm going to sleep in spite of myself. I'm going to sleep. V is for vagrant. I woke up, and it was dark, and I was so cold, and I felt for Radish, but I couldn't find her. And then I remembered, and I couldn't bear it, and I huddled under an old sack at the bottom of the garden and tried to get back into the dream. And then I woke up again, and it was light, and I heard someone out in the garden, over by the bird table. Come on, little sparrows, nice toast crumbs for breakfast. Come and have a little peck. And I've got some nuts for you too, and oh my goodness! Harry, come quick! There's some little old vagrant sleeping under the mulberry tree. A vagrant? For a moment I thought she meant a real vagrant sleeping somewhere beside me, and then I realised she meant me. Vagrants sleep rough. They don't have their own bed. They don't have a proper home. Nobody wants them. They keep shifting around and getting moved on, and everyone acts like they're a general nuisance. I'm a vagrant. I scrambled out of the old sack and struggled to my feet, and then I started running, staggering once or twice because I was so stiff. The woman gasped and then called after me, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't get the gate open, so I jumped right over it. They painted it green instead of black, and when I chanced one last look around, I saw they'd painted the front door green too. It didn't look like my mulberry cottage, without a butter yellow front door, but it isn't my mulberry cottage any more. I ran away, blundering down the road, round corners, along lanes, no longer watching where I was going, not even knowing any more, just wanting to run and run. I ran right across the road, and a car hooted at me and made me jump, so I didn't cross any more roads for a bit. And then another car hooted, and I blinked at it, bewildered because I was still safely on the pavement. And it hooted again, and someone shouted, and I saw it was Dad. Only maybe I was still dreaming because Mum was with him too. Mum and Dad together in our car. And they stopped the car with a squeal of brakes, and they were both running towards me. And suddenly I was swept up in their arms, and we were having a big hug together. Mum and Dad and me, hugging the way we used to. The three of us together. No, we used to be four. Radish! Oh, Andy, darling, don't cry. It's all right. You're safe. And we've got you back, and half the police in the country are out looking for you, but we found you ourselves, and just so long as you're okay. Oh, Andy, why did you run away? We've been so worried. We've been going out of our minds. Everyone's been searching. I cried harder. I haven't been searching. I just gave up. And she'll be so scared without me, I sobbed. Oh, I've got to go and rescue Radish. But you dropped her down some tree, darling, you said. I know which tree. It's in a garden where I go a lot. You don't mean our old garden at Mulberry Cottage? No, this is a different garden in Larkspur Lane near my school. I was looking for it last night, but I got lost. And then I was back at Mulberry Cottage. And you were there. Both of you were there. And we all had tea together, and then you both put me to bed. You must have been in a dream, Andy. Yes, I know. It wasn't ever like that, even before you split up, I say sadly. But Radish isn't a dream. She really is in the tree, and I must go and try to get her back. That blooming rabbit, said Dad. Only he didn't say blooming. But he drove us in the car to Larkspur Lane, and I pointed out the right cottage. It's still very early. We can't just barge into a private garden and start searching their trees, said Mum. Maybe we ought to wait a while. Andy, you're still frozen stiff. We ought to take you back home, and we've got to phone the police. Tell them you're safe. And I must let Bill and the children know. They're all so worried. Katie's been in floods of tears. Katie? Carrie and the twins are very upset too, and it's bad for Carrie to get in a state when the baby's nearly due. But I've got to get Radish, I said, starting to climb over the gate. I was up and over the other side before they could stop me. Andy, come back! We must knock at the front door first to ask permission. No, we can't. I'll get into trouble, I hissed, running across the wet grass towards the mulberry tree. It's okay. I know exactly where Radish is, and if you could try to get your arm down the hole, Dad, you can reach much further than me. But before I could get to the tree, I heard the door of the house opening, and someone coming out. 2 people. They'd caught us. W is for welcome. They were 2 small, plump, elderly people, both in their dressing gowns. The woman was wearing a pink quilted satin affair, the man a woolen red and blue tartan job. They both had those old-fashioned slippers with pom-poms. They certainly didn't look very frightening, but I was in such a silly state I was frightened all the same. Please, I just want to look for Radish. I'll only be a moment, I stammered. We're so sorry to disturb you like this, said Mum. I know she's very naughty playing in your garden, but my daughter's lost her toy rabbit down your tree, and that's why we're here at this God-forsaken hour, you see, to try to find it, said Dad. Oh, it's perfectly all right. We were expecting you, said the old man. Expecting the little girl? She's our little visitor, said the old woman. "She comes nearly every day, and we're always so pleased to see her." I blink at them in astonishment. "It's been grand to see her enjoying our garden. All our grandchildren are in Australia, so we've no children of our own to come and play," said the old man. "Of course we didn't like to intrude. We've been careful to keep our distance, but we couldn't help having little peeps at you now and then," said the old woman, smiling at me. "You and your little rabbit seem to be having such fun, and yesterday you stayed such a long time, and it was such a pleasure to us. But it started to get dark, and we wondered if you might have lost track of the time. We hoped you might come indoors and take a bite of tea with us, but when I came out to ask, I must have startled you, because you ran away." "I'm sorry," I said, blushing. "That was silly. And I left Radish. I dropped her down inside the mulberry tree. Do you mind if my dad tries to get her back?" "Not at all, my dear, not at all. Although you can easily reach her yourself, you know," said the old man, and he gave his wife a little nudge. "Why don't you go and look?" she said, her eyes twinkling. So I ran to the mulberry tree. I found the little hole under the branch, but it wasn't just a hole any more. Someone had stuck some little net curtains up at the entrance, turning it into a tiny window. I peered inside, but I couldn't see Radish. "That's upstairs," said the old woman. "I think she's downstairs now." I put my hand in the hole and felt, but the old woman was shaking her head. "No, dear, there's a much easier way to see downstairs. Run round to the other side of the tree and crouch down just a little," she said. I ran. I crouched. I saw another hole in the tree. There was a small doll-sized doormat at the edge, with "Welcome" in very tiny cross-stitch. I peeped past the mat, and there was my own darling Radish, stretched out happily on her own little wooden sofa, her head propped on a blue velvet cushion. I gazed at her until my eyes blurred. How did I whispered. "Just our little bit of fun, my dear," said the old woman, putting her soft hand on my shoulder. "My daughter used to play games with her little dolls inside the old mulberry, turning it into a real tree house. Arthur and I were sure you'd be back, so he did a bit of whittling and made the sofa, and I did a bit of stitching to make the whole look a bit homey." "It looks very homey," I said. "And do you know what it's called? It's Radish's own mulberry cottage." We all went inside the couple's own cottage, because they were starting to shiver in their dressing gowns, and we all had tea and hot buttered toast, and Mum and Dad explained about our own mulberry cottage, and it was all so cosy, and everyone was chatting away so happily that I started to wonder if my dream might really come true. But then, when we were back in Dad's car, he started blaming Mum for not looking after me properly when I was in bed, and she got furious and started on about my not even having a proper bed at Dad's place, and I clutched Radish and realised that some dreams can't ever come true. Radish still lives with me in my pocket most of the time because I need her so much, but she has her own mulberry cottage too, and now nearly every day after school I take her there. She goes boating on her lake, and then she has an acorn cup of mulberry juice in her own little cottage, while I have cocoa and seed cake with Mr. and Mrs. Peters. That's the name of the old couple. They asked if I'd like to call them Uncle Arthur and Auntie Gladys, but I've got too many uncles and aunties already. Sometimes just in my head I call them Granny and Grandad. I never thought I'd like any old people. Mr. and Mrs. Peters are very old, but I like them ever such a lot. X is for Xmas. You should have seen Mulberry Cottage at Christmas. I dipped a pine cone in green paint, and then I splodged on little red berries and gold stars so that Radish had her very own Christmas tree. I even made her a teeny-weeny paper chain, though Mrs. Peters had to help me because I just kept tearing it. Mrs. Peters' hands are like little claws because she has arthritis, and yet she can still make them move like magic. She gave me my own sewing box for Christmas. It's got all these little compartments stuffed with threads and needles, and a silver thimble and a tape measure that snaps back into place when you touch the button. The compartment tray lifts out at the bottom, and all sorts of materials are there from her own scrap bag, soft silks and velvets and different cottons, and tiny sprigs of flowers, and minute checks and pinhead dots, all perfect for making into dresses for Radish. She's got so many little outfits now, she wants me to change her all day long, so that she can show them all off. I've made her a dance frock that covers her paws, a velvet cloak lined with cotton wool fur, even a little sailor suit with a big white collar and a white cap and special ear holes. Mrs. Peters had to help quite a lot with that little outfit, but I did all the designing. Maybe I won't be a fashion model after all. Maybe I'll be a fashion designer. Then I don't have to bother about getting thin. Mrs. Peters is such a good cook that I'm getting bigger than ever. She doesn't mind. She says I'm a growing girl and I should eat my fill. I told Katie, and she said yes, I was growing all right. Growing ginormous. And she stuffed out her cheeks and strutted around pretending to be me. People laughed and I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I didn't hit Katie either. I just made out I didn't care and said I'd sooner be ginormous than a silly little squirt like her, and got on with my sewing. Mr. Peters gave me a whole suite of wooden furniture to go in at Mulberry Cottage. There's a big wardrobe that really opens, and a wonderful wooden trunk so Radish has got plenty of space to store her magnificent new ensembles. Mr. Peters also gave me my own big penknife with a pearl handle, so that I can do a bit of whittling myself. Mum panicked and asked Mr. Peters to look after the knife for me, so that I can only whittle when I'm with him. I think Mum worried that I might run amok and stick my penknife straight into Katie. I must admit it's a tempting thought. No, I'm joking. Don't worry. Katie's still foul most of the time, but just occasionally. She's not too bad. She gave me a little plaster ornament of Andy Pandy for my Christmas present, and I was not particularly amused, especially as I'd sewn her a special velvet Alice band to tie back her lovely long hair. But then she cleared half the windowsill of all her stuff and said that it was mine now, and I could keep my Andy Pandy ornament there. So now I own half the windowsill, and Mum found the box with some of my old stuff from our Mulberry Cottage, and I've got my china rabbits, and a Father Christmas in a glass snowstorm to keep Andy Pandy company, and all my books and some old photos of Mum and Dad, and me back at Mulberry Cottage. Dad took a special flashlight photo of Radish in her Mulberry Cottage, and I've got that too. And Radish has got her own copy, hanging on her wall like a big poster. I gave Mr. and Mrs. Peters one of the fashion modelly photos of me for a Christmas present. I wasn't sure they'd like it, but they put it in a special silver frame, and I'm in the middle of their mantelpiece with their grandchildren either side of me. I can never get to be one on my own nowadays. Y is for yacht. My second best Christmas present was from Graham. I bet you can guess what it is. It begins with Y, not a yak, a yacht. A wonderful, magnificent, correct in every detail Bunny Britannia for Radish. Mr. Peters helped Graham to make it. Mr. Peters saw Radish sailing in the modest Mark I yacht and wondered if I'd made it myself. You've done quite a professional little job there, Andy. You're quite away with wood, aren't you? He said, turning the boat backwards and forwards admiringly, but making Radish feel terribly seasick in the process. Not me. Graham made it for me. He's my sort of brother, I said proudly. I thought you always moaned about all these sisters and brothers of yours, said Mr. Peters. Not Graham. We're mates, Graham and me. That's good. Well, any time you want to bring him along with you, he'd be very welcome. Some Saturday, say? Oh, well, he's got lots of homework to do, and he shuts himself up with his computer for hours. I'm not sure he could spare the time, I said. Mr. Peters just nodded. He didn't seem to mind either way, but I did. I wanted to keep Mr. and Mrs. Peters all to myself. They'd become my sort of grandparents, and I didn't see why I should have to share them. It was enough bother having to share my mum and my dad. And yet I liked Graham a lot. He wasn't busy all the time on Saturdays. He'd like to see Radish sailing his boat on the pond. He'd like Mrs. Peters and her seed cake. He'd especially like Mr. Peters and the little lean-to at the back of the house where he did his woodwork. But what if it all got spoiled? What if Mr. and Mrs. Peters fussed around after Graham and I got left out again? But what if it was fun? I could show Graham all my secret places in the garden and all the special things Mr. and Mrs. Peters had made for me and Radish. And maybe they'd fuss over me a bit while he was there so he could see that they liked me a lot. And maybe Graham could do some whittling with Mr. Peters while I did some sewing with Mrs. Peters. And then we could all join up for tea and cakes, and that way no one would be left out. I stayed awake even longer when Katie trying to sort it all out, even longer than Katie trying to sort it all out in my head. There was no problem about asking Katie. No way. Never. But the next morning I waylaid Graham on the stairs and asked him over to the Peters place on Saturday. Oh, I'm not sure I can make it. I've got lots to do. No thanks, Andy, but I'd much rather not, he gabbled. I was mad. I thought he'd be thrilled to bits. Well, grateful at the very least. But it turned out I had to go down on my knees and beg before he'd agree to go with me. And even then he moaned and groaned all the way. This is mad, Andy. They're your friends, not mine. This old man won't really want to meet me, and I wish you hadn't shown him that boat. It was just these bits of old wood nailed together. I made it too quickly, and it wasn't any good at all. Well, Mr. Peters thought it was ever so good. He's dying to meet you, Graham. He wants to show you all his woodwork stuff, and you can have a go at making something together. I can't do things with anyone watching. I go all fingers and thumbs. Dad says I'm useless. Oh, Andy, why can't you mind your own business, said Graham, giving me a shove. But I didn't shove back. I understood. No wonder Graham was a bit of a wimp. Anyone would be, with the baboon for their dad. I suppose he loved Graham, But he certainly didn't seem to like him. He was always nagging at him to act like a real boy. If the baboon was an example of a real man, then they're pretty duff species. My mum is mad wanting a bloke like the baboon. Mad, mad, mad. Still, I don't suppose there's any way I can like it, so I'll just have to lump it, even though Uncle Bill is a blooming big lump. It's okay, Graham, I said. You don't have to feel shy. Mr. Peters is ever so nice, and he never ever shouts or gets shirty. I don't feel a bit shy, said Graham fiercely, going red. He went even redder when he met the Peters. He hung his head and didn't say anything, and when Mr. Peters asked if he'd like to see all his woodwork things, Graham just shrugged and didn't look interested. But it was all right after all. Mr. Peters nodded and didn't make a big deal about it and talked to me instead, and Mrs. Peters talked to me too, and Graham just sat and fidgeted in the armchair. But gradually his face went back to its usual pale creamy colour, and his hand crept out to touch the smooth wooden fruit bowl by his side. "Take an apple, dearie," said Mrs. Peters, but he wasn't bothered about the apples. He was looking to see how the bowl was made, and then he tiptoed over to the sideboard to have a proper look at the fancy fretwork, and Mr. Peters went to stand beside him, and they started chatting. Graham didn't say much more than yes or no at first, but eventually he started asking all sorts of questions, and they ambled off to the lean together, and that was that. We practically had to drag them away when it was tea time, even though Mrs. Peters had made a treacle tart and iced fairy cakes as well as her famous seed cake. Graham came with me to the Peters every second Saturday after that. He sometimes came over the Saturdays I was staying round at my dad's too. He and Mr. Peters worked together on his Christmas present to me, my magnificent yacht. Radish can sail across her lake in seconds now. She's hankering to take to the open sea and attempt to cross the great pond in the park. She thinks her yacht is the best Christmas present ever. Guess what my best Christmas present is? Z is for Zoe. Carrie gave birth to my half-sister a week after Christmas. She should have hurried things up a bit so she arrived on the proper present day, but that's typical of Carrie. She's always late for everything. It was my week to stay at Mum's, but Dad came round and asked if he could take me to the hospital to see the new baby all the same. I thought Mum might make a fuss, but she was in a good mood because Uncle Bill had got a new decorating job and they were celebrating on the sofa with drinks and chocolates and a smoochy video, so Mum said yes quite happily, and she even gave Dad a little kiss on the cheek and said congratulations. Dad looked pleased, and I dared hope that they might get back together after all if they were actually kissing each other nowadays. But when I saw the way Dad kissed Carrie at the hospital, I realised there were all sorts of different kisses, and some mean you love someone a great deal, and others mean you maybe still love someone a little tiny bit, but that's all. Yuck, 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 said Zen, who had to come to the hospital with us. Do you have to do all that stupid slurpy kissy stuff? I want to see my sister, said Crystal, jumping up and down excitedly, her hair all over her face. Dad was looking after the twins single-handedly, and they both looked even more ruffled and rumpled than usual. Here she is, said Carrie, holding up this little bundle in a blanket. I was right down at the end of the bed, and couldn't see much, just a tiny nose and a little red mouth. It opened, and the new sister started making a lot of noise. She's saying hello, said Carrie, grinning. Can I hold her, or... Oh, please, can I hold her, Crystal begged. Maybe you're a bit little, said Dad anxiously. No, I'm not. Am I, Mum? Said Crystal, pouting. I think you're big enough to hold the baby, but sit on the bed and lean against me so that she can snuggle up comfortably, said Carrie, getting Crystal and the baby carefully arranged. Look at me. I'm holding my sister, said Crystal, her face bright pink with pleasure. The baby's face was pink too because she was crying. I'm not big. I'm little. I'm a little wickle baby, said Zen, and he started making loud wah-wah noises, imitating the baby. Come here, little baby, said Carrie, and she scooped Zen up into her arms and held him as if he really was a baby again. He wriggled and protested, but you could tell he liked it. I stood watching them. Dad had his arm around Carrie. Carrie was cuddling Zen. Crystal was holding the new baby. I fidgeted in my pocket and found Radish. Dad saw and smiled at me. Do you want to hold your sister too, Andy? No, thanks. I'm not really that bothered about babies, I said, stroking Radish's ears. Why don't you take a turn? You might be able to stop her crying, said Carrie. But there's no room on the bed. You're big enough to hold her properly, said Crystal enviously, and Dad handed the baby over to me. I popped Radish back in my pocket and took hold of the baby. She was heavier than I'd thought she would be. I didn't know how to balance her at first, but then her head lolled against my chest, and my arms made a sort of cradle for her. She seemed to find it comfortable. She gave me one last cry, several squeaks and splutters, and then quietened completely. I looked down at her. She looked up at me. She had big blue eyes, but her hair wasn't fair like Carrie and Crystal and Zen. She had toffee-coloured curls. She was going to be dark like Dad, muddy brown like me. I gently touched her starfish hand, and her tiny fingers closed around my thumb. She's holding my hand, I whispered. She likes you. She stopped crying, said Dad. She's so little, I said, looking at her tiny fingernails, all so perfect in every detail. She's actually quite big for a baby, said Carrie, much longer and stronger than Zen and Crystal were at that stage. I think she's going to be tall. She's like me, I said. Well, she's your sister, so it's not really surprising, said Dad. Is she still going to be called Ethel, said Carrie. Yuck. Ethel's a stupid name, said Zen. I swallowed. I looked down at my sister. Yes, it is a stupid name, I said. She's pretty. She ought to have a pretty name. Well, what shall it be, said Dad. We've already got A for Andy and C for Crystal. What about B for Bella? Belly button, said Zen, sniggering. I wasn't too keen on a B name. Dad and Carrie might carry on then, and then have D for Dora and E for Emma and on all the way through the alphabet. One little half-sister was fine, but I didn't want a whole crowd of them. What about a Z name, I said. Yeah, Zed's the best. Z for Zen. That's my name, said Zen, pleased. Z for Zoe, I said. Zoe's my special favourite sister now. She really does like me. I can nearly always stop her crying, and I can give her a bottle and wash her in the bath and change her nappy, though I'm not sure that's such a treat. Mrs. Peters is helping me make Zoe a little smock with a Z for Zoe embroidered on the front. I'll maybe have to try to make something for Crystal too. She's my second favourite sister, and she gets fed up quite a bit of the time because she's not big enough to do lots of things for the baby. I found her all curled up and crying in the Japanese bag the other day. I let her play with Radish for a special treat, and it cheered her up a lot. Zen gets fed up too, but catch me letting Radish anywhere near him. I like helping look after Zoe so much that I never really want to pack my things on Fridays when I'm at Dad's. But then when I go to Mum's, I can pal around with Graham, and Paula's given me some of her old makeup, though Mum says I'm nowhere near old enough to use it yet. I look super with it on though, really grown up. Katie smeared a whole lot of makeup on too, but she just looks silly. I like a little kid with face paints. Poor old Katie. I went to see the family counselling lady the other day because she wanted to know how Radish and I were getting on. We're okay, I said. You still go to your mum's house one week and your dad's the next, she said. I've got a house A and a house B and a house C now, I said. I go to mum's house. I go to mum's house A one week and dad's house B the next week. And I go to Mr. and Mrs. Peters' house C nearly every day. And Radish gets to play in her own mulberry cottage when she's there, though she still lives in my pocket most of the time. It must take a lot of organising, said the lady, smiling. Oh, it does. But I've got it under control now, I said, smiling back at her. It's as easy as ABC, really. There we have it. That is the end of The Suitcase Kid by Jacqueline Wilson. Really hope you enjoyed that story, guys. I'll be back soon with lots more stories and videos coming your way on my channel. If you would like to subscribe or hit a like, that's always appreciated. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.